I'm delighted to welcome Laurence Westgaph to the meeting to talk to us about Cheshire and Merseyside's sort of history, philanthropy, slavery, and the empire. I hope, I think we will benefit enormously from Laurence's understanding of those issues, and a great opportunity both to listen to him and to ask questions at the end. I'll introduce Laurence properly and formally in a moment, but we just do the cabin doors to manual speech at the start. I don't need to tell you where your toilet is or where your fire escape is, but perhaps most of you, I notice, have taken your microphones off. The meeting's being recorded, so in order to maintain sound quality, if when you're not speaking you can have your microphone off, that would be really helpful, I think. Please use the chat function. I understand, Laurence, you're going to speak for about 35-40 minutes, perhaps something like that, and then there's an opportunity for question and answer. So rather than interrupt Laurence whilst he's speaking, if there's questions that occur to you on the way through, write them in the chat box and I'll try and pick them up as we move into the question and answer session towards the end. I think Edna is going to put up a hashtag up in the chat box as well. So if you want to tweet during the course of this, there's a hashtag for you there to identify this session with. So thank you very much for that. Hope we have an enjoyable session, and thank you, Laurence, again for joining us. Laurence is an independent researcher, community historian, writer, broadcaster and tour guide, and I've actually had a little sneak on YouTube and seen the sort of tours Laurence does, and once we're free again, I'm a Liverpool resident, every intention of booking on one, Laurence, because they look really interesting. And I know you're interested in Liverpool's role in the slave trade and how its legacies have benefited and impacted on the city, built environment, civic, cultural and educational institutions. So with your background and your appreciation of those things, Laurence, as I said, really looking forward to your talk. And if it's all right with you, over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you everybody and welcome. Hope you enjoyed this afternoon's chat. I will need to move on rather rapidly because I've got an awful lot of slides to show you. It's really difficult to articulate just how important slavery and empire were to the development of both Merseyside and Cheshire. Both of these areas have long histories, and I would suggest that much of that history has actually been shaped due to trade between the Americas and West Africa. This has left an indelible impact on the built environments, the public realm, and also, as Alan mentioned, and the civic, cultural and educational institutions of both areas and regions. So I'll quickly move on. First of all, in relation to Liverpool, oh goodness, it's not letting me share. There we go. Sorry guys, I have some difficulties. In relation to Liverpool, as opposed to Cheshire and Chester more particularly, Liverpool does not have a very long history. In fact, before 1699, Liverpool was not even a distinct parish. It was part of the parish of Walton. So in 1650, Liverpool's a tiny little place, only of a population of only around 1,250 people. That makes about the 12th largest conurbation in the northwest. Chester was much bigger than it. Warrington was bigger than it. Preston and Lancaster were also much bigger than it. And it's really during the 18th century that Liverpool sees this at the beginning of its great growth. In 1699, it becomes a parish in its own right. And from that period on, it sees a massive growth. So much so that between 17 and 1800, the population increases about 15-fold, taking it from, as I say, quite a small place to the second largest conurbation in the country. In 1800, only London had a larger population than Liverpool did. Now, this impacted the city in many different ways. This migration, this increase couldn't have been caused through natural increase. It had to have been caused by people migrating to Liverpool from elsewhere. Many of those people came from Cheshire, Lancashire, surrounding areas, but also from other parts of the what had become the United Kingdom in 1801, and also from much further afield, West Africa and also the Caribbean. That population increase continues throughout the 19th century, where the continued dominance of Britain, of Liverpool's involvement as the gateway to empire, continues to see the population increase. And again, this has massive knock-on effects for the rest of the region, including Cheshire. Now, in 1907, a man called Ramsay Muir, who's head of history at Liverpool, during that year, he wrote a book to commemorate Liverpool's 700th anniversary. Liverpool received its charter in 1207, but as I say, it didn't really become an important place until the beginning of the 18th century. So he wrote this book to commemorate the 700th anniversary of Liverpool receiving its charter. And in there he writes, beyond a doubt, it was the slave trade which raised Liverpool from a struggling port to be one of the richest and most prosperous trading centres of the world. I would take it a little bit further. I would say it was the slave economy. So it wasn't just this trade in enslaved people, but it was also the trade in the goods that enslaved people produced. That was the real knock-on effect. That was the commodity that was would have this great knock-on effect for the much wider region. So it's probably more accurate to refer to the slave economy. Don't think they would have talked about it in that type of terms back in the early 20th century when he wrote the book. But this has been jumped upon by more recent academics. A man called Michael Power, writing in this book, a book edited by the man who would become head of history at Liverpool, John Belcham. He edited this book in 1992. And Michael Power, in this article, in this article within the journal, within the edited volume, mentions that the slave trade is notoriously associated with Liverpool, but recent work has modified our perception of its importance and profitability. He then goes on to compare the slave trade to the trade in tobacco, cotton and sugar without a hint of irony. Who did he think was actually harvesting those goods? Obviously, these are all goods that were harvested by enslaved people, and that's why they were available cheaply, and that led to the great growth of Liverpool and its hinterland. Again, this had a massive impact on places like Warrington, Manchester, Chester, and elsewhere. So again, this is one of the ways that the importance of slavery to the development of Liverpool and its hinterland has kind of been obscured by academics, literally, writing only within the last 30 years. Now, one of the best places that slavery has been commemorated in the public realm, in the best places in inverted commas, is in Liverpool's Sefton Park. Now, there's a rather interesting statue around the park. Again, if you can see the Sefton Park farmhouse, you can see here there's some statues, and this statue here is to a man called Christopher Columbus. Now, Liverpool was the only city in the country to have a statue of Columbus right up until 1992. 1992 was the 500th anniversary of Columbus sailing the oceans blue, as they say, and that year London was gifted a statue of Columbus. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that kind of makes sense because Columbus isn't an important figure in Britain's history. Well, of course he isn't, but he's a very important figure in the history of Spain, and obviously in the United States and the Caribbean, where they celebrate, in the US, they celebrate Columbus Day, but not so much in Britain. But he's a very important figure in the history of Liverpool. And Henry Yates Thompson, one of the great Liverpool philanthropists, he had a rather interesting inscription inscribed on the plinth of this statue. It reads, "The discoverer of America was the maker of Liverpool," highlighting the importance of America in the development of Liverpool. I would go a little bit further. I would say that it wasn't only the Americas that was important to Liverpool's development, but also West Africa. And again, I'll come back to that in some detail later on. So this is Henry Yates Thompson, very interesting figure, and he too was a beneficiary of slavery. Again, if you look at the time when he was born, 1838, that was the year that apprenticeship ended in the Caribbean, when the enslaved people were finally freed after having to serve 4 years as freedmen, but as apprentices. But his family had benefited from slavery over a number of generations, and this allowed him to basically inherit so much money that he never really had to have a job, and he spent most of his time involved in philanthropy and collecting illuminated manuscripts, many of which are in the British Museum to this day. There's laboratories named up for him at the University of Liverpool because he gave an awful lot of money to the development, to the building of the building and the establishment of the laboratories. His family were involved, 3 branches of his family were involved in the slave trade: the Brooks family, the Yates family, and the Thompson family. The Brooks actually owned slave ships, the Yates family owned plantations, and the Thoms family financed many slaving voyages as members of the Haywood Bank of Liverpool. Now, one of the great institutions here in Liverpool, one of our most prestigious secondary schools, is the Blue Coats. This was founded in 1708 by a man called Brian Blundell. Brian Blundell would go on to become a very prominent slave trader in Liverpool, and he established a dynasty of slave traders over 3 generations. The family would be responsible for more than 100 slaving voyages, probably enslaved more than about 50,000 people. So a very important family in the development of Liverpool. This school was one of his great philanthropic acts. He tithed 10% of all his earnings for the running of this school right up until he died in 1756. And then he was followed by his son, Jonathan Blundell, who was more involved in the slave trade even than Brian had been. And they continue to be involved, as I say, in the slave trade and in the running of the Blue Coat School right up as late as the 1850s. Very important Liverpool slave trading family. They also then diversified into the collieries, and Jonathan Blundell was one of the premier investors in the development of the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. He was the single largest investor for the Liverpool end of the canal. Here's some research that's been done recently by a woman called Sophie Jones, and she's estimated that at least 65% of all the wealth that went into the development of the Blue Coats came from the slave economy. I actually think the figures are slightly higher than that, but she's certainly on the right road there. Now, this building, interestingly, Liverpool, again, I mentioned the population figures, it grew massively. If you know Liverpool, if you know the city centre of Liverpool, you know the Blue Coat is smack bang in the city centre. So in 1906, the school moved from this building because it was no longer seen as a fitting place to educate children, and it was moved up to Wavertree, where it still is to this day. The buildings were then acquired by Lord Leverhulme in 1909 and gifted to the Sandon Studios, and it then became the Blue Coat Chambers Art Centre, which was the first contemporary art centre in the country. Now, Lord Leverhulme's a very interesting figure, and though he comes long after slave trade and slavery has been abolished by the British, he benefits directly from forced labour in the Congo. Many of you may have heard of the terrible atrocities committed by King Leopold in the Congo during the late 19th century. Many British merchants benefited from that, and one of them was Lord Leverhulme. He leased an awful lot of palm oil plantations from King Leopold, and as well as leasing the land and the trees that were obviously on the land, he actually leased the people who lived on the land. It was forced labour that was used to harvest the palm oil that would come to Liverpool and go over to the Wirral and then be made into soap. Again, we have a great tradition of soap making here in Liverpool, and this begins really at the beginning of the 19th century with slave traders changing from trading in enslaved people to trading in what they called legitimate goods or legitimate produce, and one of those things was palm oil. Liverpool slave trading merchants pioneered the palm oil trade, which became massively important. Probably more money was made from palm oil in the 19th century than had been made through the slave trade in the 18th century, and many of the merchants who'd been involved in slave trading then became palm oil merchants. Now, one of the other great institutions in Liverpool that comes out of the slave trade was the Liverpool Infirmary, founded in 1749. Most of the original proprietors, benefactors or subscribers, whatever you want to call them, were merchants who were involved in the slave trade. One of them being a man called Thomas Seal. Again, if you know Liverpool, you know we have a Seal Street in the Walks area, and this indeed is named after Thomas Seal. Very prominent slave trader. Both him and his son, his namesake, would also follow him into the slave trade. His house here, which was at the bottom on the corner of Seal Street and Hanover Street, where the Tesco is now. This was then used as the Bank of England when the purpose-built building was completed on Castle Street. They used the former home of Thomas Seal. It was a very well-built structure. Sadly, it was destroyed during the Second World War, so we don't have it anymore. Now, as well as buying and selling enslaved people in West Africa and then selling them in the Caribbean and elsewhere, Thomas Seal actually owned a slave in Liverpool. And on the 4th of March, 1763, his slave Lydiate ran away, and this notice was put in the newspapers on the 4th of March. It was said that by Thomas Seal that he received intelligence that he was going to run away to the forest of Delamere, again over in Cheshire. This was a place which I've heard some urban legends before I actually found this advertisement saying that enslaved people did run away to the forest, and here we have it in print. So Thomas Steele was of the opinion that he'd run away to go and hide in Delamere Forest. Now, the Liverpool Infirmary, as well as being founded by Liverpool slave trading merchants, it also became very important for those wanting to work on board slave ships. The Dolben Act was passed in 1788, which made it a legal requirement that any surgeon wanting to go on board a slave ship must have a certificate of competency, which could only be gained in 3 places. Those being Edinburgh, Surgeons Hall at Liverpool, in London, and the Liverpool Infirmary, obviously Liverpool being the centre of the slave trade by the 1780s. And here we have 3 of the surgeons who were actual members of the examining board. And according to Ormerod, who is the only person to write on the early history of the Liverpool Medical School, he states quite clearly that medical examinations in Liverpool, like much else in this city, go back to the later years of the slave trade, when the examinations of the so-called African surgeons were instituted at the infirmary. Before this time, basically anyone could just mosey on up to a slave ship with their instruments and say, I'm a surgeon, take me on board now, you know, I can sail on this voyage. After the Dolben Act was passed, you had to have a certificate of accreditation. And this is the beginning of, as it says here, exams being done in Liverpool around medicine. So you had to pay, I think it was about 5 guineas in order to get this certificate. And if you failed, you had to redo it, but they also took a fee. And only about, of the more than 800 people that were actually examined, only about 600 actually received their certificate. So it was a serious examination. And this leads to the beginning of the medical school in Liverpool. Now, both of those institutions, both the Liverpool Infirmary and the medical school, would go on to become Liverpool's teaching hospital. One of the early visitors to the Liverpool Infirmary in 1794 was this man, Charles White. He was the founder of the Manchester Royal Infirmary and also St. Mary's Hospital, which was an obstetrics hospital, women's hospital. Very important figure in the history of obstetrics in this country. And he's also known as the father, well, one of the pioneers of polygenism. In 1794, when he visited Liverpool specifically to do examinations on Black men, women, and children, and he wrote about it in his book, The Account of the Regular Gradation in Man and Different Animals and Vegetables, published in 1799. Here he says, I next examined the feet of living blacks, of men, women, and children born in Liverpool and clothed and educated as the other natives of the town are. So this highlights that in as early as the 1790s, there was already a native-born black population in Liverpool. Charles White, as I say, came here basically to see if he could theorize on whether or not human beings had different origins, polygenism being the idea that the different races are originated from different human stock, so to speak. Yeah, we call that something that was first really mooted in the 18th century and will come to great prominence. Another one of the great philanthropic institutions established by the Liverpool slave traders was the Liverpool Dispensary. This was a dispensary for giving medicines to the sick, originally been founded in 1778. And then in 1782, the building that you see here, this 2-story building, was opened. It was opened on land purchased from the man who lived next door, a man called George Case, one of Liverpool's most prominent later 18th century slave trading merchants. And that's the Athenaeum Club, which you can see next. That's the original Athenaeum Club. Again, had one of the finest private libraries in the world, and still does to this day. Unfortunately, the original building was demolished back in the 1920s. So out of the medical school and the Royal Institution, really that is the foundation of what would become Liverpool University. The Royal Institution was established to promote science, literature and the arts because Liverpool, up until the beginning of the 19th century, was seen as a place that didn't have much in the way of culture. So many of the merchants, some who were former slave traders, many who owned plantations, established the Royal Institution, which actually opened in 1817. And these are the silver tickets. Again, if you the the shares were given out in shares of £100, and if you bought a £100 ticket, your name was recorded on the boards, and you're given a silver medallion known as the silver ticket for some reason. Again, if you look on these names, you'll see many very prominent Liverpool slave traders and plantation owners. There we have the Gladstone family, the father of William Ewart Gladstone, John Gladstone. He was the single largest benefactor to the Royal Institution, and the Haywoods are mentioned below. Again, they were a very prominent slave trading dynasty who founded a bank off the back of the wealth they made through slavery and the slave trade. Indeed, in Liverpool, of the 14 important banks listed after 1750, 10 of them were founded by Liverpool slave trading merchants. Here is the medallion of a man called Sir John Tobin, who I will mention to you again later on. Very important Liverpool slave trader. He starts off slave ship captain, then became a slave ship owner, and after the slave trade ended, he became one of the main importers of palm oil into Liverpool. Again, he used the same connections he'd used during the slave trade period in order to go over into the palm oil business. This is the building that actually housed the Royal Institution. It was built in 1799 as the home of a slave trader, Thomas Parr. Again, if you know the Ropeworks area of Liverpool, you'll know this building. And you know, quite fittingly, this area is slave trade central. If we were to start changing the names of streets in Liverpool, this area would become unrecognizable because almost every street in this area is named after a Liverpool slave trader. In fact, this building is surrounded on all four sides by streets which are named after Liverpool slave trading merchants. Personally, I think that we should keep the names of our streets and put plaques up reinterpreting, telling people who these individuals were and how they helped to develop Liverpool throughout the 18th century. In 2017, we held a celebration of the Liverpool Royal Institution at the University of Liverpool, which is very interesting because when we put in a Freedom of Information Act asking if the university could tell us if the organization had any connections to slavery, they said, well, we were only founded in 1881, so we post-date slavery, so it's unlikely that we have any connections. But again, in 2017, we actually held this celebration at the university, highlighting the connections between the Royal Institution and the modern university as it is today. Now, one of the most important figures in the development of what became the University College Liverpool in 1881 were the Forward brothers, very important late 19th century Liverpool philanthropists behind the development of Liverpool getting its city status, Liverpool getting University College status, and also the building of Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. Now, although you can see again these dates mean that they were born after slavery, the family made large amounts of money through the buying and selling of slave-produced cotton. And then during the American Civil War, these guys actually worked as what were called blockade runners in those days, but you know, I consider that to be a euphemism. We'd call them gun runners today. They were smuggling guns to the South during the American War of Independence. Liverpool, because so many of the merchants were reliant on cheap cotton, many of the merchants in Liverpool supported the Confederacy during the war, and the Forwards were one of those families. Even the original building of Liverpool University indirectly has a connection to slavery. The architect, one of the greatest of the late 19th century British architects, a man called Alfred Waterhouse, who would build this building. He would build Manchester Town Hall. He would also build the Natural History Museum in London. He was the architect. His father had put in a slavery compensation claim, which was actually knocked back. He had a mortgage on some slaves who were obviously had to be emancipated, and he put in a compensation claim but didn't receive any. Yes, slaves could be mortgaged. His grandfather, Nicholas Waterhouse, had been a very prominent Liverpool cotton merchant. So again, this was how people who didn't come from necessarily very affluent backgrounds were able to kind of raise up their status through acquiring wealth through slavery and then sending their children off to be educated and to join the professions. Probably one of the most prominent of Liverpool's philanthropic institutions was the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, the first of its kind in the country, founded in 1898. This was primarily founded by a man called Alfred Lewis Jones, who was the owner of the Elder Dempster shipping line, very prominent shipping line trading with West Africa. He also had the monopoly of trade between Congo and Antwerp. Edward Dean Morrell, who you can see pictured here, actually worked as a clerk for the Elder Dempster shipping line and would often go out to Antwerp to to check on the ships, etc. He noticed when he went over there, though, that these ships were coming back laden with really really valuable goods coming from the Congo, things like palm oil, rubber, and lots of other commodities. But he noticed that nothing was being sent out to trade for these. The only things that he saw going out there were soldiers and guns. So he very rapidly realized that it was it was all based on forced labor. The people of the Congo were being forced to harvest these goods, through fear of violence. Comes back to Alfred Lewis Jones and asks him what's going on here. Alfred Lewis Jones tells him to keep his mouth shut, to give him a promotion, etc. Got to keep King Leopold happy. De Morel isn't happy with that. He then leaves the Elder Dempster line and sets up the Congo Reform Association, which has its first meeting at Liverpool Philharmonic Hall in 1903, and it would be Edward de Morel who would become the great whistleblower, and that would lead to the atrocities being uncovered that were taking place in the Congo. So, a very important figure. Now, just moving across to Cheshire proper. Chester also has some long history in relation to slavery. Indeed, it was the silting up of the D that really leads to Liverpool's great growth through the slave trade. Probably would have been Chester that benefited most directly, but the D silted up and the rest is history. But that doesn't mean that we don't see remnants of slavery in both West and East Cheshire. But let's start with the county town, Chester. So here we have an advertisement from the Adams Weekly Courant, a Chester newspaper, from the 30th of January 1770. But by this time, there'd been a long history of Black people actually in Chester. So here we have some burial records. This is from Holy Trinity, which is now Guildhall. So if you know Chester, you know the old Guildhall. This was, although this church has been rebuilt, there's been a church on there going right back to about the 12th century. And here's some entries going back as early as 1623. So there's this long history of a Black presence in Chester that isn't really very well known by people today. Again, it became very fashionable by the 17th century to have a Black servant in the households of the wealthy, and this is very much seen in Cheshire parish records, not just in the county town though. One of the very important figures who's actually buried in Chester is Ukasaw Groniusaw. He was the first Black person to produce a biography in this country. And he tells his story about how he ends up in Britain through slavery, etc. And he actually died in Chester, and he's buried. But this made him very difficult to find. In fact, it was a friend of mine, a man called Terry Kavanagh, who actually found him because he had a pseudonym, an English name, James Albert. He was found, as you can see there, burial, St. Oswald, Chester, 28th September 1775. He was buried under his English name, a Black M, meaning a blackamoor or Blackmore. But we know from the the obituary that was published in the Chester Chronicle a couple of days later that that is indeed the same man who was buried in St. Oswald, which is now part of Chester Cathedral. And it was, as I say, it wasn't just in Chester that we find references to Black people. Here we have in Park Gate an advertisement, which again was printed in the Adams Weekly Courant, for a Black man who'd run away from Ireland, and an advertisement was put in the Adams Weekly Courant because he'd supposedly been sighted at Park Gate. Black people weren't only found in Chester, they were also found in many places in rural Cheshire. So here we have a baptism for a boy. Is it a baptism? Yeah, a baptism for a boy in Middlewich, 1677. So again, very early presence of Black people in rural Cheshire. As well, we also find a number of burials in the church at Malpas. Again, it seems that the Lord's Chumney, over a number of generations, had an interest in having a Black servant. You can see two references to them there. Up in Wilmslow, we also see a reference to a 17th century servant being baptized, 1685. In St. Michael's in Macclesfield, again, more baptisms, and the burial down in Peover. So again, you can get some type of idea of just how many people, it wasn't uncommon for many of these individuals to have a black servant stroke slave in their household. Now, many of the important buildings in both Liverpool and in Cheshire have connections to slavery, and Bolesworth Castle became the home of Thomas Tarleton about 1805. Thomas Tarleton was a very prominent Liverpool slave trader. Again, he came from another dynasty of slavers that came out of Liverpool. Again, many of them used their wealth to purchase large estates, and he did so and bought Bolesworth. Bolesworth would later be rebuilt by a man called George Walmsley, and then it'd be purchased by the Barber family, who still own it to this day. And again, this is an example of how the slave economy helped to develop Cheshire and elsewhere indirectly, because obviously who was picking the cotton that was being manufactured by the Barbers in Manchester? It was enslaved people, in most notably in the United States of America. Again, Thomas Tarleton, he had a slave baptized in All Saints Hart Hill, as you can see there, Bolesworth Castle, 1807. Another one of the very important buildings in what is now Cheshire is Warrington Town Hall. This was built as the home of the Patton family, and they supplied the brass and copper goods that were used as currency during the slave trade. You may have seen the manillas. These are almost like they're referred to by some people as slave bangles, and these were used as a form of currency to buy enslaved people. Many Cheshire families became quite wealthy off the back of this trade, and it said that this building, its actual foundations are made out of copper. So again, literally an example of how such one of Cheshire's finest 18th century buildings is actually built on a foundation of this commodity that was used to buy and sell enslaved people. This would the Pattons would also be involved in helping to improve industrial infrastructure also in Warrington, primarily so that they could more easily transport their goods to and from Warrington. So the Bank Quay was developed, the Mersey there was made navigable by the Patton family. Another important Liverpool slave trader was Piers Lee the 13th. They owned Lion Park, and most of the furniture, if you've been in this building, was actually purchased by Piers Lee the 13th, who was the slave trader. So again, a legacy of Liverpool slave trading found in one of the finest homes, finest stately homes of Cheshire. I mentioned how the Pattons invested in industrial infrastructure, and I also mentioned how the Blundells did. Two Liverpool slave merchants who were both involved in the salt trade, John Blackburn and John Ashton, were the principal investors in the Sankey Canal, again used to bring coal down to Liverpool. This is a picture of John Blackburn Sr. If you know Orford Park, this was the home of John Blackburn Sr., and he used his wealth to also renovate the hall. This is Orford Hall. Sadly, it's been demolished now, but you can still go and walk in the park, one of Warrington's finest green spaces. Now, here we have an advertisement from a Liverpool newspaper for the sale of a Negro girl, and it's conjecture, it's based on conjecture because we can't know one way or the other for sure, but we think that this girl may well have been Chloe Gambier. Now, Chloe Gambier was an enslaved girl who ended up living at Aston Hall. Aston Hall is just by Aston by Sutton. Well, sadly, it's been demolished today. And she was taken there as a 7-year-old girl, and she lived her entire life there, 70 years. She was actually baptized and buried in this church, which is still there to this day, St. Peter's Church, Aston. I did have a picture. I might come across it in a bit, actually, might be able to place. Her gravestone is still there, which mentions that she lived in the family for 70 years. Another one of the important stately homes in Cheshire, founded by wealth accrued through slavery, is Rookery Hall, which is now a fashionable hotel. I think that's where Posh and Becks actually announced their, crazily enough, where they announced their engagement. It was built as the home of William Hilton Cook, prominent Jamaican plantation owner who also received the family also received compensation for the slaves they had to free at abolition. This was the largest bailout. The compensation payments to the slave merchants in the 1830s was the largest British bailout right up until the banking bailout of 2008. The loans that the British government took out loans in the 1830s of £20 million in order to compensate these merchants. The slaves didn't receive a penny, but their owners received a massive amount of compensation. And these loans were not finally paid off. The bonds were not actually redeemed until 2015. So most of the people who are probably listening to this lecture, yes, you contributed to the paying back of loans that were taken out by the British government in order to compensate individuals who were already fabulously wealthy, and the owners of these plantations in the Caribbean. Some of the most prominent families were the Gladstones and the Clark family of Hyde Hall. Yeah, here we go. Got it in the wrong place. So if you look closely, you can see Chloe Gambier, a negress of Aston Hall, who lived in the Aston family for 70 years. So again, she must have gone there as a playmate for the children, and on a death certificate, it actually gives her position as housekeeper, which was the highest position that a servant could have in a female servant could have in the household. It was the equivalent of the butler, but the female version. So she'd worked her way up in the family. Again, nothing could compensate for losing your entire family. God knows what she went through in her early years, but she stayed in the family. It doesn't seem that she ever married, though, because there's no reference to children, etc. Another one of the great industrial legacies to Cheshire of our involvement, of British involvement in enslaving the slave trade, is Quarry Bank Mill. I think it's a Grade 2 star listed building. It's owned by the National Trust, and the Greggs who owned it obviously manufactured cotton goods here, but they actually owned plantations in the Caribbean, most notably in Dominica. And many of the slaves who worked on their plantations actually wore clothes that were manufactured at this mill. So this is the way that the Greggs benefited from two ends of the slave triangle, I suppose you'd say. Funnily enough, these were Unitarians as well. They married into a number of abolitionist families. Again, I'm not sure whether abolitionism stopped people from getting involved in the slave economy, or certainly buying and selling slave-produced goods. Nowadays, obviously, we'd boycott any type of oppressive regime, but in the 19th century, I don't think the merchants thought that was the way to go. Again, on the Wirral, we have the fantastic Arrow Hall and Park. This was actually, the land was actually purchased by a man called John Shaw, very notable Liverpool slave trader. Shaw Street is named after the family over here, but then it was inherited by his nephew, J.R. Nicholson, and he built this hall in 1835. Again, it's also the site of Arrow Park Hospital, a massively large estate, again, all purchased with the proceeds of slavery. Also on the Cheshire side, on the Wirral, we have Sir John Tobin, who I mentioned earlier on, as a slave ship captain and pioneering Parmore merchant. His house, Liscard Hall, became the Art College. Sadly, it was burnt down in 2008, but the grounds of the hall is still Liscard Central Park, and the church that he built for his son is standing just on the outskirts of the estate, St John's Church, Wallacey. Sir John Tobin is actually buried just to the rear of the church. Again, another fine example of Liverpool's involvement in slavery, commemorated in some fine ecclesiastical architecture. Many of Liverpool's most prominent churches were built by merchants who were involved in the slave economy. Just to finish, we have Charles Rowe. Again, this connects up the eastern part of Cheshire with slavery. Charles Rowe was a very prominent silk merchant who then diversified into copper. And I've spelled Macclesfield slightly wrong there, oops. He established the Macclesfield Copper Company, got out of the silk business, and went directly into manufacturing copper goods. Many of those copper goods were used to buy and sell enslaved people, as I mentioned earlier on in relation to the Patton family over in Warrington. And he also made copper sheathing. Copper sheathing would be used to sheath the hulls of wooden ships, cut down on the drag, but most notably, the innovation really came around for the protecting of the hulls of wooden ships that were going down into the tropical waters of West Africa primarily, and then over to the Caribbean, where the teredo worm would actually burrow in and compromise the the hills structure. So they decided that one of the ways we can stop this is to sheathe them in copper. The knock-on effect being that the ships would now sail much faster through the water, and this had a great knock-on effect for the British Navy, making our ships the fastest sailing ships. One of the reasons why we so deftly beat out the French during the Napoleonic Wars. As it mentions here, he also set up a copper smelter over in Liverpool, and he also manufactured his own currency. So these are a row penny. These could be redeemed in Macclesfield and Liverpool, and also down in Wales. I think he also set a place up in Neath. So he produced his own currency. A number of merchants did this. This was nothing out of the ordinary. This is his house in Macclesfield. There's Row Streets both in Macclesfield and Liverpool. There's two in Liverpool, Row Alley and Row Street, commemorating the connections between the Row family and Liverpool. This house is now can be used for functions, and it's also a doctor's surgery. So we're just on time, so I'll leave it there. And I'm very open for any questions. Hope you've enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Laurence, for that. That was quite fascinating. And as a now Liverpool resident, there are lots of places I recognise, and you know, it connected them with their history. So I thought that was enormously interesting. I was not surprised, because I'd heard before that the Yates family were one of the big families in Liverpool in the slave triangle, and I am able to say with some authority that I don't belong to those Yateses, but that's because I do belong to the Manchester Yateses. And the Manchester Yateses were cotton merchants and cotton manufacturers based in Macclesfield. And were the first contributors, joining Charles White, who you mentioned, creating the founder of the Manchester Royal Infirmary. They were founders of the Manchester Lunatic Asylum, Manchester Lunatic Hospital. And so I have a direct connection with the things you were describing there of my family history. In the late 1700s, the Manchester Lunatic Asylum was created, and one of my forebears was the initial treasurer of it, and the family donated £100 to establish it. So it's fascinating to make that connection with the things you were talking about. There's been quite a little bit of chat going on the sidelines, so I don't know if you can see that, but I don't know if the people can turn their microphones that can ask this. And sorry, I'm going to call you Jones B2, but I don't know who you are, Jones B2. But it might be nice to hear different voices and for you to ask the questions that you plugged down here. So this one's about what can Cheshire and Merseyside be doing to acknowledge slavery links. Are you there, Jones B2?
Yeah, hello.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, just to know really if you think that any more could be done across, you know, the regions to acknowledge the links to slavery, because I know you mentioned quite a few times that there are these buildings, and that, you know, in Liverpool you think there should be placards up around rope walks and stuff. Do you think this could be a possibility in the future, and if so, how can we push on with getting something like this done?
Absolutely. I think that it's a really positive way of kind of highlighting and addressing this history without necessarily putting anybody's nose out of joint. So I'm very much for retaining and reinterpreting this history. I don't think that street names should be changed. I'm not even a fan of tearing down statues. I think they tell us a lot about what people in the past thought was important to commemorate. So in themselves, they are historic artifacts, for want of a better word. So I would like to see plaques put up explaining who these individuals were and their history, a more complete form of their history, rather than just a Victorian or Edwardian grandizing of these individuals. I would much rather see these stories told in a more complete form and fashion. So as regards what we can do, well, we can establish organizations or speak to our councils and see if they've got any money to kind of get behind addressing this issue in the public realm. What we're doing in Liverpool, we've got a motion passed for them to start to highlight street names and also statues that have been erected to merchants who are involved in the slave economy, to help people to understand who these individuals were. Because for me, the reason why I'm not a fan of tearing these things down is that's how I learned about who these people were. You know, the forwards, for example, there's a statue of Arthur Boward forward. I go around, I've been doing my tours for 25 years. I go around the city looking at statues and then finding out who these individuals were. If we pulled them down, then I wouldn't have known where to look. I wouldn't have known about their role. So for me, I think it's an important way of kind of helping people to understand history in the public realm, which I consider to be the best classroom. I can engage with a totally different demographic in the public realm than I can in a classroom or in a seminar. You know, young people react totally differently when you take them to places of memory, historic sites, places that, you know, they've visited and they know, than they do when I just waffle at them in a classroom. So for me, it's a really useful way of using the public realm to educate. And as I say, I consider the public realm to be the best classroom. Hope that answers.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurence, for that, and for the question too. Julie's got a couple of questions about a book and what can we do. So Julie, are you there?
Yeah, hello.
Great, thanks, Julie.
I'm so sorry. I'm dyslexic and I messed up typing about my second question, so bear with me. And that's why I've been taking photos, because I'm dyslexic and can't write, watch and listen. A couple of questions really is, one, for me, who is actually quite novice, and this has been one of the best hours of my year so far without getting emotional. And sorry, Laurence, I don't think it was a very high bar, but but no, honestly, and it's made me very emotional. I'm trying to hold it back. Is there one book that you could say, top of the shop, and probably you'll say your own if you've got one, that I say as a novice could buy or get from the library to start educating me on real people's stories?
Okay, there's a couple. There's no single volume. There's a really good introduction book on Liverpool and slavery that was written just 2 years ago. It's called Liverpool and Slavery by Tony Tibbles. It's a great book. Tony Tibbles.
I've got a hearing loss as well. I'm dead lucky.
No
Tibbles.
problem.
Is it
Tibbles,
double B?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
it's double
cool.
B.
Thank you.
That's a really good book. And also, if you want to know more generally, there's a great book written over 30 years ago called Staying Power by Peter Fryer, which is about the history of Black people in Britain, which goes right back to Roman times.
I think that's what I'm after. That, yeah. I like real people's stories, like you've said. I like it comes to life. The things you engaged me with was this person lived and this was it, and this person lived and this is how he benefited, and I didn't even realise the link with palm oil. I feel thick right now. And then the other question is, and I'll get off, is, and let somebody else have a go. It's one key thing. I know you've just said what we could do with the councils, and I will do it. Is there one key thing that you could say we could all simply do?
Ooh.
I know it's a big question in it, but it's how I work. The one key thing I could do today, tomorrow.
I think it's just get more education, read up on it, and then, you know, action, you know.
Yeah. And the more I educate, I suppose the more I'll be able to speak out.
I mean, you shouldn't feel ashamed, because this information is not really out there. In Britain, the way history is taught, we very much teach it around the national story, which is quite limiting, you know. That's why we learn about particular periods and don't learn about others. You know, we spend so much time on the Tudors, you know, Henry and his 6 wives. Yeah. When we take, you know, kings and queens are not the best way to teach history, are they? No. You take the most exceptional person and you tell the history of a country through the lives of these individuals. And it's, you know, and literally, it's not the way to do it. So, and then we miss out massive periods like the British Empire. I did the Industrial Revolution at home. I mean, when I was at school, and I always thought to myself, well, where did all this cotton come from? Who was picking it? You heard that this was being made. Cotton doesn't grow within 5,000 miles of Lancashire.
So, do you know what that? And that's why I felt thick about the palm oil. I thought it was just to do saving the orangutans. Do you know what I mean? But and I'm from Chester, by the way, so that was fascinating, because I know we campaign to save things like the Guildhall, but we don't campaign in Chester about Black heritage.
Well, I mean, we're a bit in saying that, I think one of the ways that you can create more of an impetus for this is by talking about these diverse histories. So that, you know, Holy Trinity, Black, you know, enslaved people were buried there, you know, and it's forgotten about.
I
know,
do.
so
I've got
these are
another
some of the
meeting after this. I'm off to the Trinity instead. Anyway, thank you.
That's great. Thank you
Ace.
very much indeed, Julie. Really appreciate
Yeah.
that. Causes some stimulating answers. Edna, I think you're next about history shaping inequalities.
Yeah, so again, thank you, Laurence. I thought that was fascinating. I suppose my question is back to that how does it shape inequality from your perspective? Because we know that there are great inequalities from an ethnicity point of view, a racial point of view, and how do you think some of what you've told us today and previous things has shaped and influenced that?
Oh, I think it's massively important. I think this history is one of the key features and factors of the reason why anti-Black racism can be defined quite viscerally in health opportunities and, you know, life expectancy, etc. So obviously, you know, a lack of access to a realm of different benefits of living in this society has impacted Black people because of racism, and much of that racism towards Black people comes directly out of the slave trade. And I mentioned Charles White, for example, these ideas that Black people are not completely human, etc. So for example, educational opportunities, you know, we see that Black people don't tend to do as well in school. We don't see Black people going, obviously, if you're not getting a good education, then you can't get into the professions, which limits your life opportunities and the amount of money that you can earn, which obviously limits your limits your life expectancy. You know, working class people don't live as long as people from the middle classes. And, you know, even within that, Black people tend to have a lower life expectancy than white working class people. So these are the very obvious knock-on effects of history, and why history is so important for people to understand, because many of these disparities begin during the slave trade period, and also, you know, colonialism has underdeveloped Africa in so many different ways. You know, in the case of Britain, you know, why do we have such a high standard of living in this country in comparison to places that have far more in the way of natural resources, etc.? You know, Britain became a great power off the back of its empire. You know, if you think about Britain in terms of its natural resources, it has very little, has a little bit of coal, well, has quite a bit of coal and a little bit of tin, but most of Britain's wealth came from extracting it from other places, and these places were its former colonies. And again, you can see Britain's importance. Britain, and it's told in microcosm with the history of Liverpool. Liverpool becomes more important as Britain continues to acquire empire. And then as soon as Britain starts to dismantle its empire, Liverpool's great decline begins. And in many ways, that's also what you see in terms of this country. Its impact on the world has started to decline post Second World War as it started to dismantle its empire. Nevertheless, it's still the 6th largest economy in the world on the back of producing what, you know? So I think that's one of the aspects that we really need to take into consideration when we think about disparities around health and well-being, etc.
That's great. Thanks very much for the question, Edna, and thanks for your response, Laurence. So Rachel here, she needn't ask a question personally, I suspect. Just asking, do you have a Twitter handle or contact details so people can stay in touch in the future?
Yes. Well, we have, I use Instagram. It's called Liverpool in Slavery. We have a really good Facebook group. If you use Facebook, it's called Liverpool in Slavery, where we post lots of interesting information and bits and bobs. And you can find me on Twitter @andslavery.
Great, thank you. We'll get that posted out to people that have been involved. Thank you for that. Jeffrey Appleton tells us something of the history of the Athenaeum, which you referred to. I know Jeffrey's had quite a bit to do with the Athenaeum and some of the good history there is associated with it. And some Guy Kilminster recommending the Museum of Slavery in Liverpool. I presume, I guess you're familiar with that. And you tell us perhaps a little bit about that, expand on Guy's recommendation.
Well, the museum, the International Slavery Museum, is the only museum of its type in Britain. And that really tells you something about the way slavery has kind of been pushed under the carpet. When you think about how many different museums we have to crazy things like lawn mowers and, you know, doll houses, etc. So this was founded in 2007. It come off the back of the Liverpool Slavery Gallery, which was in part of the Maritime Museum. So now they've established a purpose-built, although it's still in the same building, it's got its own title as the International Slavery Museum, which is at the Albert Dock. So if you know the Albert Dock, you know the Maritime Museum. It's on the 3rd floor of that building.
That's great. Thank you very much. Perhaps Ryan, you could introduce your question about the feelings it provokes in you and how you might acknowledge those and deal with them. Ryan, do you want to come on and just highlight that question?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Alan. So yeah, just to echo some of the other comments as well, I think this was a really, really interesting lecture. So thank you very much, Laurence. And I think for me particularly, it was the slide with the newspaper advert for what we believe is Chloe Gamble. Yeah, I thought, you know, almost the feeling for that is almost this overwhelming sense of shame that actually happened and that in a newspaper something like that was printed. But I'm just wondering, because I know that this year, particularly with what happened in Bristol as well, there's almost a school of thought around the idea of erasure and erasing, sort of taking down statues and things like that. And I'm just wondering, is there a balance between sort of understanding and acknowledging the history of Cheshire and Merseyside and its links to slavery, but also, you know, not wanting to remove it completely, and you know, what is the balance there, and how can we make sure that we're not celebrating that history in a positive sense, and we're also not erasing it completely?
I think it's all about contextualization. You know, we have to look at these monuments as historic monuments that were built, that were erected at a particular time, at a time of empire, usually when Britain was celebrating the fact that it dominated the world. So they are historic monuments in themselves. And for me personally, how we get around that is by putting plaques on on these monuments, telling a more complete story about who these individuals were. You know, and it doesn't have to be done using emotive language. It can just be done quite clinically, you know, in a historical fashion. With QR codes, which now obviously we can use to provide a lot more information than we can. So you don't have to limit it to the information you get on the plaque. You can obviously then link it to a QR code. You can find out far more about this subject. I think that is a really good way of balancing the argument between tearing these things down and wanting more information, which is obviously, I would suggest that anybody who wants to turn that monument down would want people to know who these individuals were. I also do not, some people say, well, we should take them down and put them in museums. I think that that's actually a negative as well, because there's a certain demographic that goes to museums. A lot of people will never choose to go to a museum, whereas they can't avoid traversing the public realm. So you bump into history when you keep monuments in the public realm. There may be things that you find out almost by osmosis, by simply passing and go, oh, you know, I didn't know who that was. And then you'll find out, maybe click on the QR code and, you know, yeah, I've got access to a wealth of information. I think that's how we do it in a balanced way, which doesn't say to people, well, there's erasure, and it doesn't also say, well, we're continuing to honor these people. I mean, I don't think statues are the way. I think that was a very particular thing. You know, statues, some of these statues were criticized the day they were put up by people like Hugh Shimon in the Porcupine, who would make a mockery of these statues. So I think it's, again, the idea that they're on a pedestal is not something that infuriates me the way it does other people. I think they're very much of their time, and now they look a bit daft. Now they're just usually perches for seagulls to have a crap on, really, you know. So for me, retain and reinterpret.
That's a great note to end on. Laurence, it's been quite a remarkable hour. And I think if you ever have a fed up day, get the chat line and read it and see how well received your talk has been. It's absolutely fantastic that people really appreciate what you had to say, the way you've interpreted things, illustrated things for people. So enormously appreciative of you. I think the plan is to put the recording to make it available as well to people, so others that weren't able to make it today can see it. But thank you a million for that. It's been fantastic, really interesting, informative and enjoyable. That's
Thank
brilliant.
you very much. I really enjoyed it, guys.
Really appreciate it.
And there's so much that I had to leave out. So.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. And thank you, everybody, for taking part as well.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. All the best,
Thanks,
everybody.
Edna. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Cheers.
Cheerio.